Palaces shimmered, thrones glittered, but behind the velvet curtains, history's royals weren't always sober. Some ruled empires with an iron fist, others could barely lift one. This isn't a tale of noble bloodlines or divine right. It's a slow-motion collapse in silk robes soaked in laudanum, opium, morphine, and denial. These were the crowned heads who drifted through statecraft in a haze, lit from within by incense and escapism. 25 royals, one shared secret. Power, after all, isn't the only thing that's addictive. Welcome to 25 royals who were high all the time. Before we descend deeper into the velvet-lined rabbit hole, make sure you're subscribed. It helps keep the lights on in this haunted theatre of history. And while you're at it, drop a comment. Where in the world are you tuning in from? And what ungodly hour is it right now? We're betting it's either way too late or suspiciously early. Either way, you're in good company. Let's begin. 1. Jahangir. By the time Nur-ad-Din Muhammad Salim became emperor of the Mughal Empire in 1605, he was already deep into a lifelong affair with opium and wine. Not metaphorically, literally. His body, palace, and court records all bore the weight of his choices, and he made no secret of it. Jahangir didn't just consume intoxicants, he institutionalized his dependence. According to his own memoirs, yes, the man wrote his autobiography while high, he employed a servant solely to manage his drug intake. Imagine being so committed to your vices, you turned them into a government position. From the outside, Jahangir's reign looked radiant. His court was one of gold-threaded robes, perfumed gardens, jade-inlaid thrones, and a steady diet of peacock feather flattery. But beneath the silk and symmetry was a man increasingly enslaved to the needle and the cup. He claimed to regulate his drinking with the precision of a modern pharmacist, starting with 20 cups of wine a day, gradually reducing it to six daily. Of course, this self-prescribed discipline was declared by the same man who also described himself as moderate in all things, while guzzling poppy resin between royal edicts. Opium was his constant companion. Unlike alcohol, which left behind slurred speech and toppled tiaras, opium was the thinking man's drug of choice, elegant, introspective, and slowly corrosive. It matched Jahangir's aesthetic. This was a man obsessed with fine art, Persian poetry, and self-mythologizing. Under its haze, he could imagine himself a philosopher king, a connoisseur of both conquest and consciousness. Court painters immortalized him holding wine goblets like relics, their contents as sacred as the Quran's calligraphy. He wasn't drinking, he was performing it. But the real story, of course, was less romantic. Jahangir's intoxication became a logistical problem. The empire was vast, unstable, and bleeding silver through campaigns in Deccan and conflicts with Rajput states. And yet, its emperor would frequently vanish from governance, retreating into his palaces to dose and drift. When foreign dignitaries arrived, they were often greeted by a man whose pupils told more truth than his royal proclamations. Historians disagree on when exactly Jahangir's consumption turned from habit to dependency, but by the later years of his reign, it was clearly the latter. His physical health deteriorated, his moods became erratic, delegation of power became necessity, not preference. And the vacuum was quickly filled, most notably by his wife Nur Jahan, whose political genius arguably kept the empire stitched together while her husband sat somewhere in Lahore, nodding off mid-verse. The irony here is textbook. A ruler addicted to control, of territory, of culture, of legacy, was ultimately controlled by substances. But he didn't go quietly. In fact, he embraced his legacy as the drunk philosopher king. He had poems composed to the beauty of intoxication. He called wine the elixir of kings, and when it all began to catch up with him, when his body began to rot from the inside, he simply upped the dosage. There's a temptation to laugh. A wine-obsessed emperor who turned his liver into a historical footnote. But underneath the absurdity is something much darker. the emptiness that even absolute power couldn't fill. Perhaps that's why Jahangir didn't just consume opium and wine, he made them royal, ritual, religion, a toxic theology where the high was the holy, and Jahangir wasn't alone. Half a continent away, another royal sat on a different throne, equally gilded, equally trapped. She smoked her empire through a lacquered pipe, and history would remember her not for her title, but for the ash she left behind. 2. Empress Wanrong. Her wedding was styled as the return of the phoenix. The imperial robes were tailored in silence, embroidered with chrysanthemums and grief. Wanrong, born Gobolo Wanrong in 1906, was not just marrying into royalty, she was marrying into myth. At 17, she became the empress of the Qing dynasty's last emperor, Puyi, a man who no longer ruled China, but whose name still echoed like an unanswered question across the crumbling walls of the Forbidden City. But this was not the dynasty of her ancestors. By the time Wanrong became empress, the empire had already died. The revolution of 1911 had swept it away like sand in a tide. And yet the rituals remained, the palaces remained, the titles remained, a stage set with no audience, a throne room without power. Wanrong stepped into this phantom monarchy and bowed to ghosts. She was intelligent, fluent in English, educated in Western etiquette as well as Chinese classics. She wrote poems, she played piano, and she was chosen, not just for her beauty, but for her ability to maintain the illusion. She became empress of a lost kingdom. At first there was hope, a restoration maybe, a compromise monarchy, but it never came. Instead, Puyi was installed as the puppet emperor of Manchukuo in 1932, a Japanese-backed state carved out of northeastern China during the Second Sino-Japanese War. The imperial couple was moved to Changchun and placed under polite surveillance. They had palaces, yes, but also minders, restrictions, and a future designed by someone else's bureaucracy. In Manchukuo, the illusion soured, the rituals turned absurd, the staff bowed, the bells rang, the portraits hung, but there was no real sovereignty. Wanrong, once regal and composed, began to fade into silence. Her letters became clipped, her posture collapsed. The courtiers noticed, and then quietly the opium arrived. The habit crept in under the name of medicine. Sleeplessness, nerves. Puyi noticed. He recorded her use in his own memoirs, noting that she began using opium regularly in the late 1930s. But he did not intervene. If anything, he withdrew further into his own ritualized routines, his own quiet desperation. Wanrong's opium use quickly escalated from a coping mechanism to a full dependency. Records from Japanese administrators, as well as testimonies from palace staff and later historians, describe routine deliveries of the drug, often in quantities large enough to raise eyebrows, even in a court where opulence was expected. She began to miss appointments, ignore guests, wander the corridors. Servants were assigned not just to dress her, but to monitor her, report on her mood, her intake, her silences. She would sit for hours, unmoving, staring at the lacquered furniture with eyes that no longer registered the room. Some days she spoke in fragments, other days not at all. This was not the dramatic collapse of a monarch, it was the quiet corrosion of a woman who had been asked to play a role in someone else's theatre for too long. The more she retreated, the more the palace seemed to mirror her, a hollow shell, gilded and grim. Then, in 1945, it ended all at once. Japan surrendered. The puppet state collapsed. Puyi fled. Wanrong was left behind, captured by Chinese communist forces, imprisoned in a bare, cold cell with no mirror, no maids, and no morphine. The records from that time are sparse. She died less than a year later, malnourished, ill, unburied. No body was ever recovered. And yet her ghost lingers, quietly, like the smoke from a pipe long since extinguished. Not as a villain, not as a hero, but as a casualty of history's performance of an empire that asked a girl to become a symbol, then quietly erased her when the curtain fell. But she was not the only royal to lose herself in the haze. Across the border, beyond the Himalayas, a warrior king once rode with opium in his saddlebag, and a legacy of fire behind him, unified a kingdom with steel, and then in silence slowly succumbed to the very substance that crowned his court. If you're still with us after that descent into opium-drenched royalty, you're exactly the kind of curious insomniac we make this channel for. Go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this spiraling dynasty. And tell us, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Midnight? 3 a.m.? Noon on a workday? You're definitely not working? We want to know who else is wandering these historical hallways with us. 3. Ranjit Singh. In the golden glow of the Darbar Sahib, where the sacred waters of Amritsar reflected centuries of devotion, Maharaja Ranjit Singh ruled with both steel and subtlety. Known as the Lion of Punjab, he was a warlord turned emperor, a unifier of fractured Sikh missiles, and the first and only ruler to create an independent Sikh state in India. His empire stretched from the Khyber Pass to the Sutlej River, a feat unmatched in Sikh history. His court glittered with French generals, Afghan nobles, Punjabi poets, and Persian scribes. But amid the diplomacy and conquests, there was another feature of his reign. Less golden, more quietly corrosive, his deep habitual relationship with opium. Born in 1780, Ranjit Singh was raised in a Punjab shaped by conflict and recovery. He lost one eye to smallpox as a child and was thrust into military command as a teenager. By his early 20s, he had taken Lahore and was on his way to assembling an empire. But even as a young man, court records and contemporary observers noted his use of intoxicants, particularly opium. Unlike alcohol, which carried a heavier cultural taboo among many Sikhs, opium occupied a curious space in Punjabi society, both medicinal and recreational, ritual and refuge. In Ranjit Singh's case, it was all of the above. He was a ruler who combined battlefield discipline with courtly eccentricity. His military campaigns were tightly coordinated, his political alliances carefully balanced. Yet his personal life, as described in journals by British visitors and Mughal chroniclers alike, often seemed dreamlike, ornate, and increasingly veiled in narcotic haze. The Maharaja's court was known for its aesthetic grandeur. Elephants draped in embroidered velvet, walls covered in frescoes and mirrorwork. Dancers, musicians, astrologers, and Sufi poets moved through the halls. Opium was ever present, not hidden, but displayed. It was prepared in the mornings, shared among courtiers, offered to foreign diplomats as part of formal receptions. It was said that Ranjit Singh would begin his day with a carefully measured dose, often mixed into sherbet or milk, followed by several hours of rest before appearing in court. British officers, particularly those employed by the East India Company, recorded this routine with a mix of admiration and unease. They were impressed by his strategic genius, his inclusive court, his religious tolerance. He famously employed Hindus, Muslims, and Europeans in his administration, but puzzled by the way he seemed to drift through parts of his day, eyes heavy, voice slow, attention elusive. Was it a sign of weakness? They weren't sure. After all, the empire functioned. His army was disciplined, his policies coherent. He held off the British far longer than many of his contemporaries. And yet, the contradiction remained. A man who built an empire with blood and grit, and then spent large parts of his rule in a state of curated sedation. As Ranjit Singh aged, the signs of dependency grew more pronounced. His health began to deteriorate in the late 1830s. He suffered from paralysis, infections, and chronic fatigue. His opium consumption increased alongside his ailments. By then, it was no longer a habit, it was a necessity. His physicians, courtiers, and sons were aware, though no one dared challenge the routine. This was a king, after all, who had earned his indulgence, or so they believed, but the cracks beneath the gold were beginning to show. Ranjit Singh died in 1839, and with him died the centre of gravity that held the Sikh Empire together. In the years that followed, the court devolved into factionalism, assassinations, and short-lived reigns. His successors, some of whom followed his path of opium use, others undone by their own indulgences, were unable to maintain the unity he had forged. Within a decade, the British annexed Punjab. The empire was gone. So the question lingers, did Ranjit Singh's opium use weaken the foundation he had built, or was it merely a symptom of the unbearable pressure that came with holding together such a fragile constellation of forces, military, political, spiritual? Perhaps both, perhaps neither. But what's certain is this, even the Lion of Punjab needed something to quiet the noise. And like many kings before and after him, he found it in a substance that promised clarity but delivered only sleep. And while Ranjit Singh's court faded into history farther west in the Safavid palaces of Persia, another ruler driven by paranoia, instability, and a much darker spiral of addiction was about to burn out far faster. 4. Ismail Thughadin. In the marble corridors of 16th century Persia, behind silk curtains and jewelled doors, the court of the Safavids gleamed like a civilization at its peak. But that gleam, like many royal facades, concealed a darker interior, a place where succession was soaked in blood, trust was measured in ounces, and rulers could lose their grip on power before they even held it. No one embodied this fatal blend of paranoia and indulgence more completely than Ismail II, a Safavid Shah whose reign was short, strange, and deeply entangled with intoxicants. Ismail II came to power in 1576 after spending over 2 decades imprisoned by his own father, Shah Tahmasp. 20 years in a stone cell inside the remote Kakahe castle, exiled not for crime, but for the threat he posed as a prince too close to ambition. During this long, silent exile, Ismail reportedly developed a deep dependency on both alcohol and opiates. Whether to dull the monotony, escape the paranoia, or treat whatever ailments he suffered in confinement, we can't be sure. But by the time the doors of his prison finally opened, the damage had already been done. When Shah Tahmasp died, a succession crisis exploded almost immediately. Ismail, once locked away and largely forgotten, managed to rise from obscurity and claim the throne. But what emerged from the cell was not a revitalized prince. It was a deeply volatile, emotionally unstable, and chemically altered man with a crown balanced precariously on his brow. His reign lasted just over a year. Contemporary chroniclers, both Persian and foreign, describe Ismail II's behavior during his brief time on the throne as erratic, cruel, and increasingly disconnected from reality. He purged the court, executed dozens of nobles, and reportedly ordered the poisoning or assassination of any sibling or cousin who might so much as glance at the throne. Some historians have speculated that this explosion of violence was fueled not just by political insecurity, but by long-standing psychological deterioration, exacerbated by decades of confinement and years of unchecked substance use. Among those substances, opium figures prominently in the record, often intertwined with alcohol and other concoctions prepared by royal physicians or opportunistic courtiers. Safavid medical culture, influenced by Persian and Islamic traditions, frequently used opiates in both legitimate and excessive ways. For Ismail II, the line between healing and hiding was already blurred. His daily routines became increasingly strange. He would summon ministers for meetings only to lapse into silence. His temper flared with no warning. He vacillated between lavish public rituals and long reclusive periods where little was heard from the throne. Some reports describe him as suffering from intense paranoia, locking himself in his quarters, refusing food, and demanding ever larger doses of medicine, prepared in secret. Others mention his erratic appearances at court functions, often pale, disoriented, or prone to outbursts. Whether these symptoms were the result of withdrawal, intoxication, or something deeper in his psyche is still debated. The court grew uneasy, the empire already navigating internal religious tensions and growing unrest among the Qizilbash military elite began to fragment under Ismail's instability. His reforms, if they could be called that, were incoherent and short-lived. His public image, once cast as a fierce and rightful heir, quickly collapsed under the weight of his unpredictable behavior. His family, his advisors, and his guards began to circle not in loyalty, but in caution. And then, in 1577, just 14 months after becoming Shah, Ismail II was dead. Officially, the cause was listed as a sudden illness. Unofficially, rumors of poisoning, perhaps by his sister Pari Khan Khanum, perhaps by palace physicians, perhaps by a combination of court factions, became widely accepted. There was no autopsy, no trial, just a quick burial and a collective exhale. Historians have long struggled to categorize Ismail II. Was he a tyrant, a madman, a product of trauma? His addiction complicates the narrative. It wasn't just a symptom of power. It may have been the foundation on which his fragile grip on power was built. His reign didn't end in glorious battle or noble resistance. It ended in silence, shadow, and whispered justifications for a necessary disappearance. He remains an anomaly in the Safavid dynasty, an emperor whose reign was more psychodrama than governance, more opiate-induced delusion than statecraft. And yet he was far from the last. Just a few centuries later, in another Persian palace, another ruler would ascend under the banner of modernity, steel rails, military parades, and national pride. But beneath the military medals and the industrial slogans, the opium hadn't gone anywhere. It had simply adapted, refined itself, and once again, it waited for a king to need it.
5. Reza Shah Pahlavi. When Reza Shah Pahlavi seized power in 1921 and formally crowned himself Shah of Iran in 1925, he was not just replacing a dynasty, he was attempting to erase one. The Qajars had ruled with perfume and poetry. He would rule with steel and concrete. Their palaces had echoed with the soft clink of opium pipes and the rustle of courtiers. His court would echo with the sound of military boots, locomotive whistles, and printing presses. He wanted a new Iran, modern, secular, centralized. But buried beneath the surface of this industrial revolution was a quieter, older rhythm, one that Reza Shah could not, or would not, fully escape, the long, slow pulse of opium. Unlike many of the monarchs who preceded him, Reza Shah was not born into royalty. He came from humble beginnings, an illiterate military officer from Mazandaran who rose through the ranks with raw ambition and strategic alliances. His charisma was pragmatic, his politics ruthless, and his modernization campaign, though controversial and frequently brutal, was nothing short of transformative. Under his rule, Iran built roads, railways, schools, and factories. The traditional aristocracy was sidelined, the veil was discouraged, the military was expanded, Persian identity was rebranded, retooled, and placed under a nationalist spotlight. But modernizing the state did not mean modernizing the body. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, Reza Shah's public image was that of an ascetic strongman, disciplined, sober, and immune to the softness of courtly indulgence. Yet multiple scholarly sources, including medical histories, foreign diplomatic correspondence, and oral testimonies from those within the royal household, suggest a more complex portrait. Reza Shah, it seems, was a regular user of opium. Now, in Iran at the time, this was not as shocking as it might sound today. Opium use was widespread across classes. It was both a cultural relic and a normalized form of self-medication. In rural communities, it was taken for pain, hunger, and mood. In elite circles, it was refined, used ceremonially or therapeutically. Even physicians saw it as a valid treatment for a wide array of ailments, from insomnia to fatigue. Reza Shah's use, then, was not considered scandalous. It was quiet, routine, practical, but it was also telling. As the pressures of governing a volatile, rapidly transforming country increased, so too did the signs of strain in the Shah himself. By the late 1930s, diplomatic cables sent by British and Soviet observers began to describe his erratic behavior. He grew increasingly paranoid, distrustful of his ministers, suspicious of his own army. Cabinet reshuffles became frequent and abrupt. Some attributed this to his political style, centralizing, autocratic, always shifting to keep rivals off balance, but others pointed to his growing reliance on opiates. Palace staff later described his evenings as withdrawn and silent, spent in isolation with a small group of attendants. Doses were prepared by trusted physicians, always under the guise of treatment, sometimes for stomach pain, sometimes for nerves, sometimes for headaches that wouldn't go away. His intake reportedly increased over time, paralleling his emotional distance from public life. This dependency never led to the flamboyant collapse seen in earlier dynasties. There were no theatrical outbursts in court, no empty thrones or opium-fueled processions. Reza Shah functioned until the very end with military precision. But behind the public facade of discipline and order, his personal health and clarity of mind were quietly unraveling. In 1941, as World War II tore through Europe and threatened to engulf the Middle East, British and Soviet forces invaded Iran under the pretext of ensuring supply routes. Reza Shah, increasingly isolated and visibly weakened, was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The strongman of modern Iran left not with a roar, but in resignation. Exiled first to Mauritius, then to Johannesburg, Reza Shah died in 1944, thousands of miles from the country he had restructured in his own image. Accounts of his final years paint a lonely, sickly picture, removed from his power, removed from his people, and, most painfully, removed from the rituals that had held his routines together, including those quiet, unspoken doses of escape. His legacy remains divided. To some, he was a hero of modernity, a man who dragged Iran into the 20th century by sheer force of will. To others, he was a despot who trampled civil liberties and centralized corruption under the guise of reform. But regardless of judgment, one contradiction remains unresolved. The man who dreamed of building a strong, self-sufficient Iran couldn't fully free himself from the one substance that most symbolized the old order. And he wasn't alone. Just across the Gulf of Tonkin, another monarch, ornate, elusive, and increasingly isolated, was navigating the same contradiction. And as Vietnam strained under colonial rule, its emperor found comfort not in policy or people, but in the opium haze that waited patiently at the edge of every palace room. 6. Haiding when emperor. Haiding took the Vietnamese throne in 1916. He inherited not a kingdom, but a stage play, complete with imperial robes, palace guards, and ceremonial dragons, but written, directed, and increasingly paid for by the French. His reign marked the twilight of the Nguyen dynasty, a royal line that once unified Vietnam, now reduced to a ceremonial prop in the colonial script of Indochina. And like many monarchs caught between tradition and empire, Khai Ding found himself trapped by expectations, by appearances, and by something far more immediate: opium. Khai Ding ruled until 1925, just shy of a decade. But to call it a reign is generous. The real power during that time was held by the French colonial administration, which maintained a tight grip on Vietnam's infrastructure, economy, and diplomacy. What remained for Khai Ding was theatre, rituals of authority with no teeth behind them. He issued edicts, blessed temples, and appeared in lavish public ceremonies, all while Paris-appointed governors made the actual decisions. In this gap between perception and reality, opium found fertile ground. Colonial archives, Vietnamese historians, and several Western observers who visited the imperial court in Hue during his reign all make quiet, consistent references to Kai Ding's declining health and habitual use of narcotics, specifically opium, a substance both common and complicated in Southeast Asia at the time. French Indochina had, by the early 20th century, turned the opium trade into a lucrative and state-sanctioned business. Opium farms were taxed, smoking dens were licensed, revenue from the drug helped fund colonial bureaucracy. The French spoke of order and progress, but ran one of the most profitable narcotics enterprises in the world, with Vietnam as a central node. That context matters because it meant that access to the drug wasn't just easy, it was institutional. Within the royal court, opium was as much an ambient presence as incense. It was consumed for pain, for sleep, for ceremony, and for forgetting. But for Kai Din, it became more than a tool. It became a pattern. Accounts describe him retreating for long periods into private chambers. Guests and diplomats were sometimes made to wait hours or days before receiving audience. His physical condition, especially in the final years of his reign, raised eyebrows. He appeared frail, at times barely able to stand during ceremonies. Contemporary French reports diplomatically chalked it up to illness or overwork, but Vietnamese sources, and some foreign visitors less inclined to flattery, pointed directly to narcotics. The emperor, once lauded for his sharp features and meticulous dress, grew gaunt, his voice grew weak. The opium haze, used at first perhaps to soothe the humiliations of his powerless position, had taken up residence. Some claimed he took it nightly, others said it was delivered with his meals. Regardless, it became an open secret, one that fit neatly into the broader narrative of a monarch losing his grip, not only on power, but on clarity. But the story is not just one of addiction, it's one of dislocation. Kai Ding was a monarch in a country he did not truly control, leading a court that still performed ancient rituals to mask modern submission. Even his own image was shaped by outsiders. In a now famous statue commissioned in France, Kai Ding is depicted in near Romanesque grandeur, cast in bronze. The pose is imperial, the detail exquisite, and yet the statue was made abroad, shipped home like a relic, and placed in his tomb as if to solidify a legacy he never authored. He was in many ways a monarch caught mid-century, too late for sovereignty, too early for resistance. His death in 1925 was followed by the ascension of his son, Bao Dai, the last emperor of Vietnam, a man who would inherit not just the throne, but the same stage play, now with more urgent script changes. But Kai Ding's legacy lingers in the moral tension of his life, a king who presided over an empire of symbols, a palace of incense and policy pamphlets, a royal court, where the smoke rising in the courtyards was no longer from altars alone. And as the opium flowed through the palace walls of Hue, back in London, another ruler, more celebrated, more studied, but no less seduced by the pharmaceutical comforts of the age, was preparing for a reign built on painkillers, potions, and the slow unravelling of his body beneath the velvet weight of the crown. 7. George IV. From the outside, George IV appeared to be everything a Georgian-era monarch ought to be, resplendent in velvet, surrounded by portraits of himself and chronically overdressed for every occasion. His court shimmered with chandeliers and courtiers, his every public appearance designed to dazzle and distract. But underneath the gold braid and powdered hair was a man who spent most of his adult life staggering under the combined weight of pain, public scrutiny, and what might be one of history's most theatrical dependencies on opium. He was born in 1762, the eldest son of King George III, and lived much of his life waiting for his father's mind to finally collapse, for the throne to finally fall into his lap, for his ailments to become someone else's problem. When he did become king in 1820, he was already 57, bloated by indulgence, haunted by the press, and wrapped in scandal. But long before the crown touched his head, George had built a reputation as a man of bottomless appetites. Food, drink, clothes, lovers, architecture, and, crucially, laudanum. Laudanum was a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, and by the late 18th century, it was the go-to solution for nearly everything in aristocratic Britain, from insomnia to heartbreak to gout. George IV had all three. His lifelong struggle with chronic pain, likely aggravated by gout and obesity, led him to consume increasing quantities of the substance, under the direction of royal physicians who saw no issue in prescribing opium with the same casualness as they would prescribe lavender water. By the time he was appointed Prince Regent in 1811, after his father's final descent into madness, George's use of laudanum had already shifted from treatment to dependency. He took it regularly, often with wine, sometimes with food, and increasingly in isolation. Some of his letters from this period are oddly disjointed, reflective of a mind drifting between lucidity and lethargy. Cabinet members and diplomats reported that the prince could be eloquent one moment, then utterly withdrawn the next. Audiences were rescheduled, meetings delayed, royal appearances shortened, and through it all, laudanum was administered as both medicine and mask. His physicians seemed more concerned with maintaining appearances than monitoring dosage. The palace operated like a theatre with no intermission, as long as George could be wheeled out for ceremonial duties and waved through dinners with foreign dignitaries. The question of what he was taking behind the scenes remained politely unasked. Yet even in private, George IV was a man of contradictions. He was known to binge and crash, gorging on food one day, fasting the next, engaging in opulent projects like the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, then withdrawing to Windsor in a state of torpor. His palace was filled with curiosities, mirrors, Chinese vases, and costly distractions, perhaps the only things that kept his internal chaos temporarily manageable. His public image, meanwhile, was in free fall. The newspapers mocked him ruthlessly. Caricaturists like James Gilray turned him into a national punchline, depicting him as bloated, cowardly, and perpetually under the influence. It wasn't just that he was seen as ineffective, it was that he was perceived as absent. The king, who had once been a patron of the arts, had become a cautionary tale in real time. Yet despite everything, George IV remained on the throne until his death in 1830. He did not abdicate. He did not collapse in scandal. He simply eroded, slowly, quietly, and chemically. In his final years, he became a virtual recluse, rarely appearing in public and reportedly consumed by paranoia and pain. Doctors increased his laudanum dosages. He suffered from bladder problems, hardened arteries, and what some have described as depressive episodes. His correspondence thinned, his political will faded, and his death at Windsor was met with more relief than mourning. He was succeeded by his brother, William IV, who inherited the throne, along with the same doctors, the same palace routines, and the same quiet dependency culture that had marked the court for decades. The irony, of course, is that George IV had once been called the first gentleman of Europe. He had set fashion trends, supported the Royal Academy, and cultivated a version of monarchy that was supposed to dazzle with charm and taste. But behind the embroidered waistcoats and Georgian elegance was a monarch quietly numbed by laudanum, unable to reconcile the performance of kingship with the pain of actually living it. And he was not alone in this. Even before George had picked up the bottle, his royal lineage, his very bloodline, had already begun weaving a culture of dependency. Because before George IV became the public face of royal excess, his youth had been shaped by another user, one closer to home, Prince Salim, heir to a different kind of empire where opium wasn't a scandal, it was simply a part of growing up.
8. Prince Salim, before he became Emperor Jahangir,
Before the gilded chronicles and imperial memoirs, before he inherited the peacock throne of the Mughal Empire, he was simply Salim, a prince growing up in a palace built on splendor and smoke. Born in 1569 to Akbar the Great, one of the most powerful and visionary emperors in Indian history, Prince Salim entered the world as an heir not just to a throne, but to a legacy that, like many empires, was gilded on the outside and quietly decaying on the inside. From a young age, Salim's life was one of ritual, surveillance, and overwhelming expectation. Akbar, who famously experimented with religious philosophy and centralized administration, was a ruler who demanded loyalty and discipline from his ministers, his generals, and especially his son. Salim was raised not as a child, but as a symbol, and symbols, as history shows us, tend to crack before they crumble. The prince's early life was regimented in public, indulgent in private. While his tutors delivered lessons in Persian literature, military strategy, and courtly etiquette, his nights, especially in adolescence, grew increasingly untethered. Opium and wine were present at court, not as illicit vices but as ceremonial tools, medicinal aids, and social lubricants. For Salim, however, they became more than tradition. They became habit. By his teenage years, multiple chroniclers, including imperial historians and later Mughal biographers, record Salim's deepening indulgence in opium and alcohol. The court, watching carefully, began to whisper. His absences were noted, his temper flared, his judgments wavered. For Akbar, who had spent decades constructing an empire based on stability and reason, this was more than a family issue. It was a dynastic threat. The tension between father and son came to a head in the late 1590s, when Salim, tired of waiting for a crown that refused to arrive, attempted to rebel. He declared himself emperor in Allahabad, minted his own coins, and began issuing edicts. This was not simply a power grab, it was a cry for independence, filtered through a haze of privilege, resentment, and likely opium. Akbar responded not with force, but with maneuvering. He dispatched emissaries, negotiated through intermediaries, and eventually lured Salim back into the fold. But the damage was done. The rebellion had been bloodless, but the fracture was lasting. Salim's addiction did not disappear with reconciliation. In fact, as Akbar aged and Salim moved closer to power, his use reportedly intensified. Contemporary sources describe him maintaining a dedicated servant whose only job was to manage his opium supply, preparing it, measuring it, ensuring its availability. It became woven into the rhythms of his day. When Akbar finally died in 1605, Salim ascended the throne as Emperor Jahangir. And with that crown came both vindication and collapse. He was no longer rebelling, but he was no longer resisting. Either, as emperor, he indulged openly. His own memoirs, the Tuzuki Jahangiri, offer a surprisingly candid glimpse into his life, including his reliance on intoxicants. He writes of gradually reducing his wine intake, an effort encouraged by his physicians and advisors, but makes no such promises about opium. If anything, it was the substance he clung to, quietly, consistently, and without apology. His rule, while far from catastrophic, bore the marks of this dependency. Jahangir delegated heavily to his wife, Nur Jahan, one of the most influential women in Mughal history, who effectively ran the court in his stead during his more withdrawn periods. Foreign ambassadors remarked on the emperor's inconsistencies, sometimes sharp and engaged, sometimes sluggish and distracted. His decisions were often delayed. His presence was increasingly ceremonial. Yet for all his flaws, Jahangir was not a monster. He was a connoisseur of art, a patron of architecture, a ruler who admired beauty and sought to preserve harmony in a vast and diverse empire. His judgments, when made, were often humane. His interest in justice, wildlife, and religious tolerance reflected the lingering idealism of his father's court. But that idealism came filtered through a fog. Historians today continue to debate the extent of his addiction's impact on governance. Did opium weaken the empire's foundation, or did it simply anesthetize a ruler who was never truly allowed to be human? The truth, as always, lies in the contradiction. Salim the prince became Jahangir the emperor, but never quite outran the quiet dependency that had grown alongside him like a shadow. And as Jahangir ruled behind veils of incense and opium smoke, his sons watched and learned. One in particular, Prince Parviz, would grow up not merely to inherit a crown, but to inherit the same habits, only this time without the poetry. 9. Prince Parviz. He was born into opulence, named with celestial ambition, Parviz meaning fortunate or victorious in Persian. But Prince Parviz, the son of Emperor Jahangir and a grandson of the mighty Akbar, was neither. He never ruled, he never led an army that changed the fate of a continent, and yet his story survives, not as a tale of power, but of excess, inertia, and the slow rot of potential corroded by indulgence and empire's finest narcotic comforts. Parviz was a prince of the late Mughal court, a world thick with ritual, wine, poetry, and political decay. By the time he came of age in the early 1600s, the empire was still rich but beginning to rust. Its gilded image, preserved in architecture, miniature paintings, and Persian calligraphy, masked a reality of succession crises, infighting, and administrative sclerosis. In this world, Parviz was a classic second-string royal, high-ranking, noble-blooded, and perpetually just outside the center of power. And like many men in that position, he did what court culture quietly allowed. He disappeared into comfort. Descriptions of Prince Parviz from Mughal chroniclers and later historians are unusually consistent in tone. He was handsome, charming, generous to his retinue, and almost entirely ineffective as a political figure. His father, Emperor Jahangir, never seriously considered him for succession, even though Parviz was one of his older sons. Why? Because Parviz was, by all accounts, too far gone, wrapped in a life of intoxication and distraction, ill-suited for the burdens of rule. His primary companions, both literal and metaphorical, were wine and opium. Like his father before him, Parviz relied on these substances not merely as courtly indulgences, but as lifestyle. Reports suggest that he rarely appeared at court without showing signs of intoxication. He would slur in public, forget appointments, or issue contradictory commands that his staff quietly ignored. And yet, as was typical of the late Mughal aristocracy, his status protected him, at least for a time. The palace ran on hierarchy and illusion. A prince could be utterly disengaged and still command a battalion, a villa, and a line of sycophants. The most infamous episode of Parviz's life, his failed campaign against the Deccan Sultanates, crystallized this reputation. In 1620, Jahangir sent him to lead a military expedition. But rather than take command in any meaningful way, Parviz reportedly delegated all real responsibilities to his commander-in-chief, the capable and far more sober Mahabat Khan. While Parviz remained in camp, surrounded by entertainers and his personal opium preparers, Khan led the army. The campaign was passable in execution, but disastrous in perception. Rumors flew. Foreign ambassadors wrote home in bemused dismay. Even within the court, whispers began to circulate that the prince was becoming a liability. Jahangir himself wrote with veiled disappointment in his memoirs. He never publicly condemned Parviz, but he also never gave him real power again. Instead, succession hopes shifted toward Khurram, Parviz's younger, more ambitious, and significantly more ruthless brother. That name, of course, would become famous in another form: Shah Jahan, the future builder of the Taj Mahal. Compared to Shah Jahan's eventual rise, Parviz's story feels ghost-like, a fading figure who never quite seized his chance. He lingered in the palace for years, fading further into irrelevance. His entourage became more of a bubble than a court. His decisions grew erratic. And while some advisors attempted to prop him up as a political counterweight to his brothers during moments of succession tension, no one truly believed he could hold the empire together. He couldn't even hold his own evenings together. By the late 1620s, Parviz's health was visibly deteriorating. Court records describe repeated medical interventions, none of which made a difference. The opium had worn away not just his vitality, but his judgment. He died in 1626 at the age of 38 in a quiet room far from any battlefield or throne. His passing was noted with formality, not grief. There was no palace coup, no civil war fought in his name, only a whisper of what might have been had the prince chosen to wield his gifts rather than dull them. But perhaps that was the point. In a court where the walls whispered betrayal, where succession meant fratricide, and where even emperors were stalked by shadows, maybe Parviz had chosen the safest exile of all, intoxication. It cost him everything, but spared him the one fate worse than obscurity, power. Yet his story was far from isolated. Within the same empire, on the same tapestry of silk and smoke, another prince, Sher Singh of the Sikh dynasty, would follow a similar pattern. One foot in the saddle, the other in the opium bowl. His empire, too, would blur at the edges as the line between ruler and escapist began to fade.
10. Sher Singh. Sher Singh's name sounds like strength. Lion by title, heir to a warrior dynasty, cloaked in the legend of the Sikh Empire, his father Ranjit Singh carved out with blood and brilliance. But names are only armour until they're tested, and by the time Sher Singh took the throne in 1841, the armour was already cracked. The empire was fraying, the courtiers were scheming, and the royal lineage, thick with ambition and addiction, was starting to devour itself from the inside out. Sher Singh was Ranjit Singh's son, though not the only one. The Lion of Punjab had left behind a legacy of both military conquests and palace instability, with numerous heirs and half-heirs vying for the throne. When Sher Singh finally seized power after a bout of fratricidal chess, it wasn't through divine succession, it was through gunpowder and palace manoeuvring, and once he had the crown, he wore it like a man both relieved and overwhelmed. But by then, the court was already drowning in opium. The culture of indulgence that had once been a side note in Ranjit Singh's rule had grown into something larger, something ritualized. Sikh sources and colonial records alike describe the court in Lahore as increasingly dependent on intoxicants not just for recreation but for function. Ceremonial opium use, once a show of hospitality or warrior composure, became habitual. Pipes were passed like scrolls, doses became daily, and Sher Singh, like many around him, didn't just inherit the crown, he inherited the coping mechanisms that came with it. There are few detailed personal diaries from Sher Singh himself, but the accounts that survive, letters, reports, memoirs from visiting British officers and disaffected nobles, paint the portrait of a ruler whose strength was as much projected as real. He was described as sociable, charismatic, even charming when he needed to be. But behind closed doors, his reliance on opium was consistent and visible. Courtiers noted his long absences, his dulled responses during meetings, his unpredictable moods. The pipe was never far from reach. It didn't help that the empire was slipping. British interference loomed like a second sun. Internal rebellions, factionalism among Sikh nobility, and the spectre of colonial manipulation created a pressure cooker of expectation and instability. Sher Singh was supposed to hold it all together, but what happens when the person tasked with saving the house can barely stand upright inside it? The irony wasn't lost on his contemporaries. A ruler named for a lion, presiding over a court full of sheep in gold-threaded robes, all quietly feeding the same dependency. His reign lasted barely 2 years. In 1843, he was assassinated in a palace coup, shot by a rival claimant in his own gardens. It was a violent end, but not an unexpected one.
The empire by then was already unraveling, and still Sher Singh's story didn't end with his bloodline. It echoed down the marble corridors of Lahore Fort, through the opium haze of courtrooms, and into the brief reign of his own half-brother, a ruler so disoriented by drugs and power that even his enemies were embarrassed by how little it took to topple him. 11. Karak Singh. If Sher Singh was the lion in name only, his half-brother Karak Singh was something else entirely, a royal heir who moved like a shadow through his own reign, occupying the throne without truly sitting in it. Born as the eldest legitimate son of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, Karak Singh should have been the natural successor to an empire built by steel and willpower. Instead, he became a tragic emblem of what happens when power is inherited but never quite grasped, physically present, politically absent, and, by many accounts, chemically subdued. Karak Singh officially ascended the throne in 1839, immediately following his father's death. It was meant to be a moment of dynastic continuity, the peaceful passing of power from builder to heir. But the handoff was already spoiled. Karak Singh's reputation, long before his coronation, was mired in allegations of incompetence and excessive indulgence. Among those allegations, one loomed larger than the rest: his alleged addiction to opium. The evidence isn't tabloid rumor. It comes from contemporary observers, both Indian and European, who described the new Maharaja as lethargic, passive, and frequently disconnected from court affairs. British officials stationed nearby noted that he seemed incapable of carrying on public business, and that major decisions were often deferred or quietly overruled by more competent ministers. His son, now Nihal Singh, along with key courtiers like Raja Dhyan Singh, took on the actual burdens of governance, while Karak Singh sat in ceremonial silence. Was he truly addicted? The records suggest a strong probability. Accounts describe him as often being in a stupor, unable to engage in court discussions or military planning. The diagnosis of opium addiction would have been informal, of course, applied retroactively through anecdotal evidence and interpretive hindsight. But the pattern fits: daily absenteeism, physical weakness, periods of isolation, and a court culture where opium use was not only tolerated but entrenched. It's worth remembering that Ranjit Singh himself had normalized such practices in court, although he managed to balance them, at least in appearance, with statesmanship and charisma. Karak Singh inherited the habit without the discipline. His indulgence became a liability, not a flourish. While his father had used opium as a companion to power, Karak Singh seemed to use it as a replacement. His reign was brief, just 1 year, and ended in quiet catastrophe. In late 1840, he died under suspicious circumstances. Some suggest he was slowly poisoned by courtiers who had lost faith in his ability to rule. Others argue that his declining health was a natural result of long-term substance use, compounded by political stress and palace intrigue. Either way, he died not with a roar, but with a murmur. Karak Singh's fall wasn't dramatic, but it was instructive. It showed that in the machinery of empire, a single malfunctioning cog, especially one at the very top, could trigger systemic collapse. His son died shortly thereafter under equally strange circumstances, and within a few years, the Sikh Empire had entered its final turbulent chapter. But the phenomenon wasn't limited to Punjab. Far to the west, in the glittering courts of Persia, another dynasty faced a strangely familiar dilemma: how to maintain imperial order while the man in charge slipped further into the velvet fog of the poppy. 12. Nasir al-Din Shah Qajar. In the late 19th century, the Qajar court of Persia had all the appearances of an empire trying to modernize. Railroads were planned, European photographers were invited to the palace, and Persian royalty posed stiffly in uniforms stitched in Paris. But behind the mirrors and manuscripts, something older clung to the halls: the sweet, smoky scent of opium. And no figure better embodied this contradiction, this court of velvet decay, than Nasir al-Din Shah Qajar. He reigned from 1848 to 1896, nearly half a century, and during that time he tried to drag Persia toward modernity with one hand while holding tightly to its oldest habits with the other. His diaries are full of reflections on power, poetry, astronomy, and women, hundreds of women. But read between the lines, and another quiet pattern emerges: the normalization and possible personal indulgence of opium use at the highest levels of Persian society. To be clear, the evidence of Nasir al-Din Shah's own addiction is more circumstantial than sensational. He wasn't caught nodding off during council meetings or scribbling edicts in a daze. Instead, his reliance, if not outright dependency on opium, was observed through the rhythms of his daily life, the culture of his court, and the writings of those around him. Cultural historians and medical scholars examining Qajar Iran often cite him in the broader context of a royal elite for whom opium was more than common. It was practically constitutional. In 19th century Persia, opium was not a vice. It was a tradition. It soothed the sick, entertained the bored, and silenced the discontented. It was sold in markets, prescribed by doctors, and gifted between officials. Within the royal court, it had its own rituals: silken pouches, delicate pipes, a form of leisure that became part of governance itself. And for Nasir al-Din Shah, whose reign balanced precariously between absolutism and reform, opium offered more than relief. It offered control. It dulled unrest. It blurred contradictions. It quieted dissent in both the body and the court. Yet there were costs. As the Shah aged, his physical and emotional health became increasingly erratic. His diaries reveal long periods of fatigue, chronic pain, and vague melancholia. His relationships with ministers grew more distrustful. His interest in European ideas, once a source of innovation, began to slip into mimicry without substance. Some modern scholars suggest that his increasing isolation and hesitation in his later years could be linked not just to the burden of monarchy, but to the effects of long-term opium use, which had by then become endemic among the upper classes. And while Nasir al-Din Shah managed to outlive many of his rivals, he couldn't outgovern the creeping stagnation. Despite grand ambitions for reform, his reign ended with Persia more fragile than fortified. He was assassinated in 1896 by a revolutionary with a pistol and a pamphlet, not long after attending a religious shrine. His death shocked the court, but not the country, which had long sensed that the throne was occupied by a man drifting gently downward. And like all patterns of power and decay, this one didn't die with him. His successors, raised in the same perfumed chambers, taught the same soft rituals, would carry forward the very same habits, some even more brazenly. One in particular, his son and heir, would take the crown and the pipe in equal measure and leave behind a reign defined by morphine, melancholy, and a truly imperial appetite for forgetting. 13. Mozaffar al-Din Shah Qajar. By the time Mozaffar al-Din Shah Qajar ascended to the peacock throne in 1896, Persia was less an empire than a jigsaw puzzle of debts, foreign concessions, and unspoken dependencies, both political and chemical. His father, Nasir al-Din Shah, had ruled for nearly 50 years, a span long enough to establish opium not only as a courtly indulgence but as a deeply embedded cultural institution. Mozaffar didn't just inherit a kingdom, he inherited its exhaustion, its bureaucracy, and its narcotics cabinet. From the outset, he was seen as an unlikely king. Timid in speech, soft in constitution, and more inclined to deference than decision, Mozaffar al-Din Shah seemed almost allergic to the grandiosity expected of monarchs. But he had one thing in abundance: illness. Reports from court physicians describe a ruler beset by chronic ailments, digestive issues, nerve disorders, insomnia, migraines. Whether these were exaggerated, psychosomatic, or entirely real is up for debate. What's not debated is the treatment. In the late Qajar court, chronic illness had one answer: opium, or increasingly, morphine. Mozaffar's reign unfolded like a tired opera. He travelled frequently to Europe, both for medical treatment and to experience modernity at arm's length. He was fascinated by cinema, brought back the first motion picture camera to Iran, and spent extravagantly on foreign equipment while his subjects struggled under mounting inflation. But behind the velvet curtains of the palace, his private life was remarkably consistent. Long hours in bed, minimal public engagement, and a regiment of pharmaceutical care that bordered on ritual. Historical accounts, including those from Persian courtiers, European diplomats, and later constitutionalist thinkers, refer directly to the Shah's dependence on narcotics. Morphine, by then, was viewed as the modern successor to opium, a cleaner, more scientific alternative. It was administered through injections by palace doctors and became a cornerstone of his medical regimen. Rather than invigorating him, it further distanced him from governance. Even supporters began to whisper that the Shah lived in a fog, well-meaning but absent, physically present at court but mentally reclining in some imagined recovery room. As the kingdom's crisis deepened, Mozaffar al-Din Shah's capacity to respond diminished. Foreign powers, chiefly Russia and Britain, tightened their grip through oil concessions and economic manipulation. Within Persia, intellectuals and merchants, long frustrated by corruption and royal passivity, pushed for reform. The constitutional revolution was brewing. In 1906, after mounting pressure, the Shah was forced to sign the decree that established a national parliament, the Majlis, a landmark moment in Iranian political history. But he did so from a position of extreme physical weakness, reportedly confined to his bed and heavily medicated. He died later, that year, just 5 months after signing the constitution. His reign lasted 10 years, but left behind very little in the way of accomplishment, save for the political awakening that occurred almost in spite of him. What remains of Mozaffar al-Din Shah's legacy is a peculiar blend of indulgence and inertia. He wasn't a villain. He wasn't a reformer. He was a monarch padded in prescriptions, carried along by court routines, and quietly overwhelmed by a body that refused to serve the empire he nominally led. And yet, even centuries earlier, that same pattern, powerful men brought low by poppy and privilege, had played out across the empire they once envied. Back in the Mughal court, a flamboyant emperor took the throne with silks on his back and opium in his bloodstream, proving that in times of decline, ceremony is no match for sedation. 14. Muhammad Shah. In the crumbling days of the Mughal Empire, spectacle outlived strength. The armies were thinning, the provinces were restless, and the treasury echoed louder than the courtiers. But if you had wandered into the Red Fort during the reign of Muhammad Shah from 1719 to 1748, you might not have noticed any of that at first. The fountains still flowed, the walls still shimmered, and the peacocks still strutted through the gardens. It all looked very much like an empire, until you looked closer. Then you'd see it, the opium pipe by the throne, the emperor's drifting gaze, the rituals that had grown heavier than the crown itself. Muhammad Shah, often remembered with the title Rangila, the colourful, was not a conqueror. He was a performer. His court was famous for its music, its dance, its poetry, and its absolute devotion to the aesthetics of power. But behind the velvet curtains and mirrored halls, the empire was dying. And Muhammad Shah, more than any ruler before him, seemed content to watch it unravel from a cushion of scented silk and sweetened smoke. Contemporary accounts from both Indian chroniclers and European visitors describe a ruler increasingly disengaged from governance. Where his predecessors had held court with generals and ministers, Muhammad Shah preferred musicians and storytellers. He was a patron of the arts, yes, but also of distraction. His public appearances were infrequent, his political decisions delayed, and his ministers left to manage the administrative machinery of an empire slowly grinding to a halt. And then there was the opium. Though Mughal emperors before him had indulged, Muhammad Shah's relationship with the drug was both more open and more central to his daily routine. Period historians, including those sympathetic to the dynasty, noted his frequent use of opium, often taken in the form of a sweetened beverage or smoked in private rooms behind the Diwani khas. It wasn't merely occasional, it was institutional, a way to pass the hours between festivals or to dull the quiet horror of imperial decline. It wasn't just the emperor either. His court had become a mirror of his habits. Nobles followed his lead, adopting a culture of detachment and indulgence. The real work of governance was increasingly outsourced to ambitious wazirs, regional governors, or more troublingly, to opportunistic agents of foreign powers. The British East India Company, for instance, noted how easy it had become to secure trade privileges under Muhammad Shah's reign. A little gold, a little flattery, a little timing, that was all it took. But perhaps the most vivid symbol of Muhammad Shah's failure came in 1739, when Nader Shah of Persia invaded India and marched directly into Delhi. The Mughal army was crushed, the city was looted. The emperor, reportedly stunned and powerless, watched as the Persian conqueror took the peacock throne, the Koh-i-Noor diamond, and what was left of the empire's dignity. And yet, after Nader Shah departed, Muhammad Shah continued to rule. Formally, at least, he returned to his court, resumed his ceremonies, and reportedly slipped back into the comforts of routine. The opium, as always, remained. He died in 1748, having presided over the slow-motion collapse of a dynasty once thought eternal. He didn't fall in battle or die in exile. He simply faded, like smoke rising from a court that had mistaken intoxication for immortality. But even among his descendants, the pattern would not break. In fact, it would repeat itself in more intimate, ironic ways. Because the very son who succeeded him had his own relationship with empire and escape, and this time the tragedy would arrive not with a foreign army, but from within the imperial nursery itself. 15. Prince Mianning. Before he became the Daoguang Emperor of Qing China, Prince Mianning was a boy of privilege in a palace full of contradictions. Born in 1782 into the imperial family, he grew up surrounded by order. Rituals, hierarchies, schedules, traditions so rigid they made the Forbidden City feel more like a museum than a home. But within that ornate machine, something much looser had already taken root. Something smoky, sweet and slow. Opium. By the early 19th century, opium use among Qing aristocracy wasn't scandalous. It was fashionable, cultured, poetic even. It appeared in paintings, poems and parlor talk. It was said to inspire clarity, conversation and calm, and for young princes like Mianning, it was almost inevitable. He had everything else, why not the pipe too? The historical record on Mianning's early use is, as with most imperial figures, cautiously vague, but hints do slip through. Qing-era documents reference his youthful experimentation with opium in carefully coded language. Phrases like delight in the pipe or interest in the clouds. He wouldn't have been alone. Within the imperial household, opium was both commodity and ceremony. The finest blends were gifted from provinces, offered during banquets, shared among confidants. To partake was to participate. And so Mianning did. Still, he was no caricature. He was intelligent, capable, and, at least early in life, marked by a seriousness that made him stand out among his royal peers. When he was selected as heir to his father, the Jia Qing Emperor, many believed he could steer the Qing dynasty through the mounting internal unrest and foreign pressure. But when Mianning became Daoguang Emperor in 1820, he inherited more than just a throne. He He inherited an empire already saturated with contradictions, and opium was chief among them. By then, opium wasn't just a courtly indulgence, it was a national emergency. British merchants were smuggling it into China by the ton, flooding southern ports and draining the silver reserves. Addiction had begun spreading from the palaces to the villages, from soldiers to scholars. The emperor's own officials were implicated in trafficking. It was no longer a pastime, it was a crisis. And here's the irony. Daoguang is remembered in part for trying to stop it. In the 1830s, he launched a campaign against opium, appointing the famously incorruptible Lin Zexu to crack down on trade. The result: the seizure and destruction of millions of pounds of opium, and, eventually, the First Opium War with Britain. A conflict China would lose disastrously, but Daoguang's personal history with opium complicates his legacy. Some historians believe his early use made him more lenient toward those in his court who continued to indulge. Others suggest he may have stopped using it entirely after ascending the throne, turning his back on the very habit he once praised in his youth. There's no definitive proof of addiction, but the tension between his policies and his past hovers like a cloud over his reign. He died in 1850, leaving behind a China weakened by foreign incursion, internal rebellion, and institutional contradiction. His successors would face even greater turmoil, typing rebellions, more wars, and a dynasty buckling under its own beautiful, brittle architecture. But while opium flowed freely in Beijing's marble corridors, it also coursed through the deserts and hills of Western India, where a very different kind of royalty was busy turning poppy into ritual, and ritual into dependence. Their kingdoms were smaller, their titles less global, but their habits just as grand. 16. Rajput rulers of Marwar and Jodhpur. In the desert kingdoms of Rajasthan, history rides on horseback. The Rajput rulers of Marwar and Jodhpur built a legacy of valor, aesthetic extravagance, and stubborn autonomy. Men who decorated their palaces with peacock motifs and their reputations with tales of resistance against empire. But behind the moustaches curled like sabres and the mirror-tiled courtyards, a quieter tradition flourished. It wasn't spoken of with shame, it was practiced with ceremony, passed down like armor or honor, and it came in the form of ammal, opium. To understand the Rajput relationship with opium, you have to set aside modern ideas of vice. In these princely states, opium was not only accepted, it was essential. It was part of religious rites, diplomatic meetings, wedding negotiations, and daily life. It was taken before battles and before breakfast. Guests were welcomed with amal pani, a diluted drink of opium and water, served from silver cups in gestures of respect, like a handshake you could sip. Refusing it was seen as an insult. Accepting it was the first step toward inclusion. Among the most cited rulers associated with habitual opium use was Jaswant Singh II of Jodhpur, who reigned from 1873 to 1895. Described by British colonial officials as charismatic, disciplined, and politically astute, Jaswant Singh was also known to have partaken in opium daily, a fact recorded not as a flaw but as part of his noble routine. His use was not seen as an indulgence, but as a hallmark of class and dignity bound up in centuries of Rajput identity. And he was not alone. Successors and contemporaries, including members of the Marwar dynasty, followed similar patterns. Some rulers would host formal opium ceremonies before military campaigns or important state functions, sealing loyalty through shared intoxication. The ritualistic aspect of opium created an invisible thread through the fabric of Rajput statecraft. It bonded courtiers, soothed tensions, and replaced more modern mechanisms of diplomacy with a substance that could level egos and blur disputes. But what happens when ritual becomes routine? Over time, the ceremonial gave way to the habitual. British medical officers stationed in princely India began to report that many of the region's royals and nobles exhibited signs of chronic dependency. Some suffered from the physical symptoms of long-term use: drowsiness, digestive trouble, diminished vitality. Others displayed a more administrative form of decay: absenteeism, inertia, and an over-reliance on British political agents to manage day-to-day governance. The contradiction was sharp. These were warrior kings, custodians of ancient codes of honor, who ruled over sunburned kingdoms from within cool marble palaces, sipping poppy resin like it was tradition itself. The empire was changing. Railroads came, telegraph lines, tax reform. But in the palaces of Marwar and Jodhpur, a slower rhythm persisted, one where the line between heritage and habit grew thinner by the year. This wasn't collapse, it was preservation at a cost, and that cost would become apparent when the next generation of royals, less trained in war, more surrounded by flattery and colonial bureaucracy, found themselves lost in ritual without purpose. Just like a certain Mughal emperor whose reign was so short, so drenched in dissipation, and so overshadowed by opium that he remains better known for how he floated than how he ruled. 17. Jahandar Shah. If the Mughal Empire had a hangover phase, Jahandar Shah was it. His reign, lasting barely a year, from 1712 to 1713, wasn't so much a period of governance as it was a theatrical stumble through the last vestiges of imperial pretense. He didn't ride into Delhi like a conqueror. He wobbled in like a man who had finally gotten his turn at the buffet, only to discover that half the dishes were empty and the candles had burned down to their wicks. Jahandar Shah wasn't supposed to be emperor. Not really. He was one of several sons of Bahadur Shah I, and when his father died, succession turned into a gladiatorial contest among brothers. After a brief but bloody power struggle, Jahandar emerged victorious, not by brilliance, but by aligning with the right general at the right time. The victory was hollow. The court was fractured, the treasury exhausted, and the emperor distracted. His reputation for indulgence was immediate and unmistakable. Even in a court where opulence had long been mistaken for competence, Jahandar stood out. His court was described by contemporaries as bloated with entertainers, flatterers, and opportunists. Lavish ceremonies replaced statecraft. Public audiences were fewer, shorter, and increasingly irrelevant. Behind closed doors, the emperor slipped into habits that had long been whispers in the Mughal lineage: a deep reliance on wine, and an even deeper entanglement with opium. Multiple historical accounts suggest that Jahandar Shah's use of opium was not ceremonial or symbolic. It was functional, embedded into his daily routine. Intoxicants were taken before court sessions, during private audiences, and, most notably, in the company of his favorite courtesan-turned-consort, Lal Kunwar. She was a former dancing girl elevated to the role of unofficial queen, and the two of them became infamous for their decadent lifestyle. They were inseparable, indulgent, and, for the traditionalist nobility of the time, intolerable. Opium, in this environment, became more than a substance. It was a symbol, not just of personal dependency, but of institutional decay. Court chroniclers describe an emperor who laughed at court protocols, who skipped religious ceremonies, and who reportedly showed more interest in poetry and performance than in politics. The line between escapism and leadership was erased, or perhaps never drawn in the first place. His enemies didn't have to wait long. Less than a year into his reign, a rival prince, Farrukhsiyar, returned with military backing and public support. The empire, starved for direction, turned quickly. Jahandar Shah fled the capital, but not far enough. He was captured, imprisoned, and later executed, quietly, without drama. The only surprise was how little resistance he offered, as if even he had realized that the crown he wore was more costume than command. And yet, For all his mockery in history books, Jahandar Shah was not an anomaly. He was a
continuation, another ruler in a long sequence of emperors numbing themselves while the empire crumbled under the weight of ritual and rot. Even his inner circle reflected this rot. The courtiers, princes, and generals surrounding him were no strangers to the same intoxicants. In fact, some of them became legends in their own right, not for ruling, but for how thoroughly they surrendered to the haze. 18. Prince Parvez's Circle. In the glittering yet gradually unravelling court of Mughal India, the addictions of emperors were rarely isolated. Where there was one wine glass, there were a dozen more. Where there was one pipe, there were 5 being passed in quiet corners. And nowhere was this more evident than in the orbit surrounding Prince Parvez, the ill-fated son of Emperor Jahangir. While Parvez himself was already a cautionary tale, a prince best remembered for his habitual excess and his spectacular failure to live up to imperial expectations, his court, his entourage, and the culture that surrounded him were perhaps even more telling. Because Parvez was not an outlier, he was a mirror reflecting a broader malaise. The courtiers who attended him, the generals who followed him, the poets who sang for him, they were all breathing in the same air, and much of that air, by most credible accounts, was laced with opium. Parvez's household, as recorded in Mughal chronicles and later assessments by historians, was a hotbed of indulgence. While his younger brother Khurram, later crowned Shah Jahan, was off waging campaigns and building reputations, Parvez's faction in the Mughal court seemed far more invested in parties than policy. His gatherings were legendary, not for their brilliance, but for their excess. There were nightly feasts, endless music, rivers of wine, and crucially, a shared reliance on intoxicants that blurred the line between celebration and sedation. Chroniclers from the time didn't mince words. Some described his inner circle as enveloped in pleasure. Others called it a court of smoke and mirrors. There are references to attendants tasked specifically with preparing opium mixtures, entertainers who were paid not just for their art, but for their company, and officials who abandoned their duties in favor of proximity to the prince's seemingly bottomless hospitality. The drugs weren't hidden. They were normalized, a functioning part of the social order within the court. What's more, this communal dependency bled into military affairs. During the Deccan campaigns, where Parvez was nominally in command, reports from imperial sources point to widespread dysfunction among his commanders, many of whom were drawn from his own intimate circle. One general, Mahabat Khan, effectively ran the military effort on Parvez's behalf, navigating not only battlefield challenges, but also the slow-moving machinery of an army whose leadership often appeared distracted, disjointed, or simply unfit to respond. Some historians argue that these failures weren't just the result of incompetence, but of chemical inertia. The most remarkable thing about this shared decline is how unremarkable it seemed at the time. The Mughal court, by the early 17th century, had already begun to drift from its early discipline and militaristic rigor. What once was a lean engine of conquest had become a baroque theatre of etiquette, art, and increasing escapism, and Prince Parvez's circle was simply playing its part in that grand performance. Opium pipe in hand, loyalty for sale, ambition dulled to a distant memory. They were young men born into greatness but drugged into irrelevance. And yet, far from the palaces of Hindustan, on an island wrapped in spice and whispers of trade, another royal was succumbing to a different kind of imperial rot, where opium wasn't just a habit but part of an economy, a weapon and a legacy all its own. 19. Sultan Bargash of Zanzibar. On the sun-soaked shores of East Africa, where the winds carried the scent of cloves and empire, Sultan Bargash of Zanzibar ruled with opulence, cunning, and a curiously modern flair. His palace was a marvel of coral stone and carved wood, filled with European furniture, Persian rugs, and brass fixtures polished to a colonial shine. Bargash fancied himself a cosmopolitan ruler,
a man who drank from the teacups of Europe and lounged in the silks of Arabia. But behind the ornate veneer of diplomacy and infrastructure, his court bore another signature of the 19th century's global entanglements: opium. Bargash, who ruled from 1870 to 1888, presided over a sultanate at a cultural and economic crossroads. Zanzibar was the hub of Indian Ocean trade, a place where ivory, spices, slaves and narcotics crossed paths daily. British, Omani, German and Indian influences all vied for dominance, but beneath the flags and treaties it was commerce that ruled, and opium, by the time of Bargash's reign, was a regular fixture in both the economy and the palace. Contemporary memoirs, colonial reports and diplomatic correspondence make frequent reference to the opium trade in Zanzibar and, more quietly, to the habits of its elite. The British, who were beginning to tighten their grip on the island through protectorate negotiations, often noted the irony of preaching moral improvement while watching palatial compounds that smelled faintly of incense and something else. The opium was often smoked, sometimes brewed, and always circulated through back channels polite society pretended not to see. Bargash himself was known for his lavish lifestyle. He imported pianos and chandeliers from Europe, commissioned portraits of himself in Western dress, and modernized parts of the capital city, Stone Town, with gas lighting and piped water. But modernity, in his case, didn't necessarily mean moderation. Multiple sources imply that the Sultan indulged in narcotics, not simply as an idle pleasure, but as part of a larger culture of courtly excess. British travellers noted his erratic moods, sudden changes in policy, and increasingly withdrawn behaviour in his later years. Some attributed this to illness or stress, others whispered about opium. His court was full of sycophants, intermediaries, and hangers-on, many of whom shared the same habits. The line between ceremony and dependency was often blurred. A visiting official from Bombay once wrote that the Sultan's courtiers seemed to move in slow time, as if the air itself had thickened in the palace. It was a poetic way of describing a room where more than just incense was burning. Yet Bargash was no fool. He navigated treaties, resisted annexation for a time, and built one of the most influential courts in East Africa. But even his considerable charm and political acumen couldn't stop the tide. By the end of his reign, the British had effectively turned Zanzibar into a Hian protectorate. The economy was buckling, the palace was losing relevance, and the court, by now comfortably anaesthetized, seemed more like a stage set from a previous century than the engine of a modern state. He died in 1888, leaving behind a kingdom gilded in memory but hollowed by modernity, dependency and denial. And just as Zanzibar's sultanate slipped into colonial shadow, the Mughals, those once mighty kings of the subcontinent, were already generations deep into their own decline, handing the throne to emperors so entangled in indulgence they became passengers in their own histories. One of them would soon follow, barely holding the empire in place as it unravelled around him, quietly, dutifully, and always with a haze in his eyes. 20. Ahmad Shah Bahadur. By the time Ahmad Shah Bahadur inherited the Mughal throne in 1748, the empire was less an empire and more a delicate illusion. It shimmered in miniature paintings, echoed in poetry, and loomed in the names of cities and forts, but its substance had long since begun to vanish. Ahmad Shah stepped into this fragile legacy like a man walking onto a crumbling stage set, robes flowing, titles recited, drums beating, and then promptly lost the script. He was the son of Muhammad Shah Rangila, the pleasure-loving emperor whose court had been known more for its perfumes and poets than its policies. And like his father, Ahmad Shah was raised in an environment where power was ornamental, where the real work of governance had long since passed into the hands of ministers, generals, and scheming courtiers. The emperor, in this arrangement, was a symbol, ornate, isolated, and increasingly sedated. From the very start, Ahmad Shah Bahadur was unprepared. Accounts from both Mughal chroniclers and European observers describe a ruler who seemed confused by the crown rather than empowered by it. He came to power at the age of 22, just as the empire was reeling from the aftershocks of Nader Shah's invasion, a blow from which Delhi never fully recovered. The treasury was depleted, the army demoralized, and the provinces restless. It was a moment that called for a leader of precision, decisiveness, and clarity. Instead, it got Ahmad Shah. Court records from his reign reveal a young emperor deeply insulated from the mechanics of state. He relied almost entirely on his vizier, Safdar Jang, for political decisions, military campaigns, and even ceremonial functions. Ahmad Shah preferred to remain within the palace, attended by eunuchs, astrologers, entertainers, and, notably, those responsible for preparing and administering his daily doses of opium. Unlike his father, who at least masked his indulgence with charisma and a theatrical flair, Ahmad Shah seemed to retreat into it. The opium wasn't just a luxury, it was an escape. This wasn't uncommon in the Mughal court by the 18th century. Opium had become the quiet rhythm behind many of the emperor's rituals. Chroniclers mention how he would often be absent from morning durbars or appear visibly drowsy during audiences. His health was reportedly poor, and his mental state fragile. Some attributed his passivity to constitution. Others pointed to the daily use of narcotics that had long been normalized within court life. But Ahmad Shah Bahadur's withdrawal from governance had consequences. His over-reliance on Safdar Jang alienated powerful factions in the nobility, especially the Turani and Irani groups who viewed the vizier's power as overreaching. In 1753, after a series of political missteps, Safdar Jang was dismissed. With his strongest advisor gone, Ahmad Shah was exposed, politically, militarily, and personally. The resulting chaos was swift. Intrigues flourished. His own mother, Qudsiya Begum, began pulling strings from behind the curtain, forming alliances and issuing orders in his name. His stepbrother, Prince Aziz-ud-Din, gained support among discontented nobles, and all the while Ahmad Shah seemed incapable of responding. Adrift in the palace, his authority drained as completely as the imperial coffers. In 1754, he was formally deposed by his own wazir Imad-ul-Mulk, a man once loyal but now ambitious enough to stage a soft coup. Ahmad Shah was blinded, a symbolic act meant to ensure he could never rule again, and quietly placed under house arrest. It was a cruel and ceremonial end, not uncommon in a court that had come to value appearance over reality. And yet, even in his deposition, he was treated not as a traitor or a tyrant, but as a man who had simply failed to awaken. His addiction wasn't a scandal, it was an inevitability. The empire had been hollowed out long before he took the throne. He merely inhabited its final, fragile shell, numbing himself while the edifice collapsed. Ahmad Shah Bahadur lived another 18 years after his fall from power, long enough to see the empire splinter further, long enough to watch others wear the same crown that had weighed so heavily on him. But he never returned to the court, never attempted a comeback. He remained in quiet exile, his life reduced to faded memories and a name in footnotes. His story, like so many in the late Mughal period, isn't one of tyranny or triumph. It's one of absence, of emperors who no longer ruled, of courtiers who no longer served, and of rituals that continued long after their meaning had dissolved. And in that soft collapse, opium was both cause and companion. But while Mughal India drifted in slow decay across the deserts of North Africa, a different kind of monarch struggled to maintain power, not against invaders, but against the soft, creeping habits of court life, where indulgence masqueraded as legacy and power slowly dissolved into smoke.
21. Sultan Ismail of Morocco.
If Ahmad Shah Bahadur ruled at the twilight of a fading empire, then Sultan Ismail of Morocco stood at the opposite end of the imperial spectrum, ruling not in decline but in defiance. His reign, from 1672 to 1727, was anything but quiet. Known as one of the longest reigning monarchs in Moroccan history, Ismail left behind a legacy defined by iron discipline, architectural ambition, and a near-mythic appetite for power. But woven into this formidable rule is a lesser-known strand, one that drifts through travellers' journals and court rumours, and lingers in the footnotes of diplomatic letters, the shadow of drug use within his court, and possibly within the Sultan himself. To understand the context, we must understand the court of Meknes under Ismail, a place both fearsome and theatrical. He built it as a Moroccan Versailles, a city of massive walls, ornate gates, endless stables, and palaces that seemed pulled straight from dreams of eternal empire. It was constructed not just of stone, but of symbolism. This was Morocco under consolidation, a state stitched together from fractious tribes, rebellious ports, and reluctant mountain enclaves. Sultan Ismail's governance was absolute, but it had to be. The unity he forged was hard-earned, constantly tested, and held together by a tight web of force, loyalty, spectacle, and occasionally sedation. Accounts from European envoys, especially those stationed in the court during the late 17th and early 18th centuries, offer glimpses of court life that are equal parts ceremonial and surreal. These reports, often coloured by a mixture of awe and suspicion, frequently mention the presence of narcotics within the royal household. Hashish was known to be widespread in North Africa during the period, but opium, while less ubiquitous, had begun to make its way through trade routes, medical exchanges, and imperial courts. Whether imported through Ottoman connections, passed along Mediterranean networks, or introduced via Persian emissaries, the substance was not entirely foreign to Morocco's elite. Sultan Ismail himself, towering in reputation and physicality, is described by some sources as an ascetic, and by others as prone to contradiction. While officially portraying himself as devout and disciplined, leading prayers, enforcing Islamic law, and promoting religious learning, he also maintained an enormous harem, a vast retinue of servants, and an increasingly insular inner circle that dealt not just in governance but in quiet indulgence. It is within this inner sanctum that rumours of narcotic use linger. European travellers wrote of court banquets where certain officials arrived in altered states, of sessions that ended in laughter that seemed inspired more by fog than wine, and of royal physicians preparing sedative tinctures for the Sultan's chronic fatigue and temperamental storms. Some speculated that Ismail himself, especially in his later years, relied on compounds to ease pain and restlessness. Opium, most likely in a medicinal form, administered under the guise of treatment. But even if the Sultan himself was not a habitual user, his court certainly exhibited the signs of a culture grappling with the trappings of power. Long periods of boredom, sudden bursts of paranoia, and increasing reliance on rituals that blurred the line between spiritual devotion and courtly escapism. Several high-ranking officials were quietly dismissed during Ismail's reign under vague accusations of inappropriate conduct, and some contemporary scholars believe these charges may have involved chronic intoxication. It's worth noting that in pre-modern Islamic courts, addiction was not always understood in the clinical terms we use today. Instead, it was described in moral, behavioral, or spiritual language. Men who lost their balance, failed in their duties, or became unreliable. Within that framework, Ismail's later years, marked by increasing political erraticism, suspicious purges, and a kind of obsessive architectural mania, begin to take on a different hue. Was it simply age, isolation, or something more pharmacological? When Ismail died in 1727, the empire he had built so aggressively began to wobble almost immediately. His sons and grandsons fell into civil war.
Succession became a blur of assassinations, exiles, and brief reigns. His glorious capital of Meknes began to fade, its stone walls cracking under the weight of neglect. His name remained legendary, but the stability he enforced vanished with unsettling speed. And while historians often attribute this collapse to the centralization of power, the lack of institutional continuity, and the brutality of his reign, there's another layer worth considering: the culture he created. A court in which control was absolute, but behind the scenes, control may have been slipping quietly and chemically. And so, once again, we find that even the strongest rulers, the empire builders and throne holders, are not immune to the soft erosion of habit. Whether through pipes or potions, vials or rituals, the high reaches of power often drift into haze. And nowhere was that more evident than in the mountains of Afghanistan, where a dethroned monarch once found comfort not in armies or allies, but in a familiar powdery escape, a habit he would carry with him from exile to restoration and back again.
22. Shah Shuja Durrani. In the mountains of Afghanistan, where monarchies were often forged with fire and unmade by whisper, Shah Shuja Durrani's name still lingers, not as a conqueror, not quite as a martyr, but as something else entirely. A man who returned to power not by force or fate, but by the fragile scaffolding of foreign intervention and personal addiction. His reigns were short, spaced apart by exile, and marked more by longing than by leadership. But through all the shifting allegiances, betrayals, and hopeful restorations, one thing remained disturbingly constant: his relationship with opium. Born in 1785 into the turbulent royal house of the Durrani Empire, Shah Shuja became king of Afghanistan in 1803. It was not a peaceful accession. His early reign was defined by a web of tribal politics, court rivalries, and the rising ambitions of neighboring powers. Barely 5 years later, in 1809, he was overthrown, sent into exile, stripped of his throne, but not of his title. For the next 30 years, he would become a wandering monarch, a deposed king who survived not through armies or revolts, but by weaving himself into the ambitions of others, especially the British. It was during this prolonged exile in India, particularly in the Punjab and later in Ludhiana under British protection, that the outlines of his addiction come into focus. British colonial officers, Indian observers, and later historians all describe a man increasingly dependent on opium, not as a matter of ceremony or occasional indulgence, but as part of his daily routine. He was described as reclusive, often disengaged, and visibly altered in his demeanor. His reliance on the drug was noted with both pity and strategic concern by the British, who saw in Shah Shuja a pliable figurehead for their growing interests in Afghan affairs. The First Anglo-Afghan War, launched in 1839, became the stage for his brief return. Backed by British military force, Shah Shuja was reinstalled as king in Kabul more than 3 decades after his original reign had ended, but it was a restoration in name only. Real power rested with British officers and advisors. The Afghan people viewed him not as a returning sovereign, but as a puppet, an artifact of foreign ambition wrapped in imperial silk. And through it all, the opium continued. Contemporary reports from Kabul during this second reign describe a court in limbo, half Persian splendor, half colonial experiment. Shah Shuja, aging and diminished, often held court in seclusion. He rarely engaged directly with tribal leaders or the political challenges mounting around him. British envoys expressed frustration with his passivity and vague responses. Some speculated that his inability or unwillingness to fully assert control over his court and capital was due in part to his prolonged and heavy use of opium. What makes Shah Shuja's case especially haunting is the way his addiction seemed to parallel the decline of his political agency. As his dependence deepened, his sovereignty evaporated. He was no longer a ruler of men, but a symbolic fixture placed on a throne to justify an occupation. His royal commands carried little weight, and his advisors were either British appointees or old allies who had grown tired of waiting for a king to act like one. By 1842, less than 3 years after his restoration, it all came crashing down. The British occupation faced fierce resistance, culminating in one of the most infamous retreats in colonial history. Shah Shuja, abandoned by most of his allies and loathed by his people, was assassinated in Kabul, killed not by policy or politics, but by the accumulated resentment of a population that never welcomed him back. He died, in a way, twice, once when he lost his kingdom, and again when he returned to it with the weight of foreign bayonets and the fog of addiction clouding his judgment. His story, like so many in the 19th century, is caught in the bind between empire and exile. He was a king in name, a pawn in practice, and a man whose inner world, broken by decades of disappointment, became increasingly numbed by the one thing he could still control, the contents of his pipe. And yet even his fate was far from unique, because just across the Persian border, in the rose gardens and courtyards of Qajar, Iran, a whole class of princes and statesmen were falling into the same soft spiral, where aristocratic charm met chemical solace, and the opium trade didn't just enrich the elite, it consumed them. 23. Qajar princes and grandees. By the 19th century, the Qajar dynasty had settled into a peculiar rhythm. Iran was a land of domes and decay, where royal carriages rolled through crumbling streets and mirrored halls reflected not power, but nostalgia. The Qajars held court like they were preserving a dream, each prince and grandee cloaked in silk, lost in ceremony, and quietly slipping into a haze that smelled faintly of rosewater and poppy. If addiction had a throne room, it might have looked like this. The royal family under the Qajars was vast, entangled, and expensive. Scores of princes, governors, and aristocrats were handed positions of privilege with little expectation of competence. Titles were abundant. Responsibility was optional. In such an atmosphere, opium found not only acceptance, it found reverence. It was the unofficial language of leisure and the preferred tool for erasing everything from boredom to betrayal. Among the Qajar elite, opium wasn't a scandal, it was a lifestyle. Historians, physicians, and contemporary travelers all converge on the same observation. The 19th century Iranian nobility was deeply structurally intertwined with opium use. Medical journals from the era describe the high frequency of opiate prescriptions among the upper class. British envoys stationed in Tehran and Isfahan remarked on the visibly diminished state of many court officials, glassy-eyed, sluggish, distracted. Persian chroniclers, more elliptical in tone, described certain governors as no longer alert or devoted to stillness. These were polite phrases used to avoid saying aloud what everyone already knew. Among the worst-kept secrets of the time was that entire wings of the Qajar bureaucracy functioned in a kind of collective sedation. Princes were appointed to govern provinces they never visited. Ministers attended meetings only to fall silent halfway through. Ceremonial duties were fulfilled, barely. But decision-making, reform, and any sense of urgency were conspicuously absent. And through all of this, opium continued to circulate. Delivered discreetly in ornate containers, consumed in private gardens, administered under the pretense of health or digestion. Some among the elite were famous for their use. Take the case of a certain prince-governor in Fars, known for hosting elaborate literary salons where the poetry flowed as freely as the poppy syrup. His guests, poets, scholars, merchants, would gather under lantern-lit arches to recite couplets and trade commentary while reclining on cushions, eyes half-lidded, speech meandering. These were not simply gatherings of intellectual exchange, they were rituals of mutual forgetting. Forgetting the Russian incursions in the north, forgetting the mounting debt, forgetting the reality that Iran, once a mighty empire, was becoming a pawn in a game played by European powers. The irony was sharp. The very class tasked with defending Persian sovereignty was sleepwalking through its erosion, and no one seemed alarmed, not really, because addiction at this level of society had ceased to be a crisis. It had become a custom. Even the royal physicians were complicit. Opium was regularly prescribed for fatigue, melancholy, stomach pain, insomnia, and nervous ailments, all diagnoses so vague they could cover any complaint or no complaint at all. For the Qajar elite, there was little distinction between medicine and recreation. The body was an extension of courtly protocol, and its discomforts were to be managed with taste, not scrutiny. As a result, entire administrative offices began to slow. Petitions from provinces went unanswered. Reforms were announced with great fanfare and quietly shelved. It wasn't that the state had collapsed. It was still there, still issuing stamps and seals and salaries. But it had begun to resemble a wax museum of governance, animated by rituals and narcotics rather than ideas. Yet perhaps the most haunting aspect of this elite addiction was its silence. No dramatic falls, no moral reckonings, just a steady, perfumed descent. The Qajar princes did not rage against the dying of their authority. They reclined, composed verses, and waited for their next dose. And when foreign powers advanced treaties that stripped away autonomy, when railroads and telegraphs arrived with foreign oversight, the reaction was muted, as if the opium had not only dulled their pain, but also their resistance. It would take another generation and the rise of constitutionalists, nationalists, and revolutionaries to break this spell, but by then the damage was done. The Qajar dynasty, once ornamental and indulgent, became irrelevant, and yet, even beyond the deserts and domes of Persia, halfway across the Pacific, on an island monarchy caught between kingdoms and corporations, another royal court found itself entangled in the same opium web, this time not through tradition, but through scandal, profit, and a slow erosion of sovereignty that came not on the battlefield, but in the smoke-filled rooms of high society. 24. King Kalakaua's Court. In the final decades of the 19th century, the Hawaiian kingdom was a fragile miracle, a Polynesian monarchy perched on volcanic rock, surviving in a world where every other island had already been claimed, colonized, or carved up by Western empires. It was a kingdom of contradictions, coconut groves beside telegraph wires, ancient chants echoing under gaslit chandeliers. At the center of this balancing act stood King David Kalakaua, the last reigning king of Hawaii, a monarch equal parts visionary and romantic, eager to modernize while fiercely defending the island's identity. But even in paradise, temptation found its way in. And in Kalakaua's court, opium didn't arrive as an exotic vice. It arrived as politics, policy, and scandal. To be clear, the king himself was never confirmed as a user of opium. Unlike other royals in this litany of habitual indulgence, Kalakaua's connection to the drug was not through addiction, but through access. Yet the story of his court's entanglement with opium is no less tangled, no less corrosive because of it. Because in Hawaii, the drug wasn't simply consumed, it was commodified, legislated, weaponized, and eventually it helped fracture the very monarchy it flowed through. By the 1880s, opium use was already widespread in the Hawaiian Islands, particularly among Chinese laborers brought in to work on sugar plantations. As in many parts of the Pacific and Asia, the drug had moved along trade routes with merchants and migrants, creating a shadow economy that thrived wherever official oversight was weak or compromised. In Hawaii, that shadow grew long. Enter the opium license scandal, the incident that would link Kalakaua's reign forever to the politics of narcotics. In 1886, a law was passed authorizing the government to issue a single license for the legal sale of opium. The goal, officially, was to regulate a growing problem and bring order to a chaotic underground market. But almost immediately, allegations began to swirl. Several individuals, including a notorious businessman named Tong Ki, also known as Aki, claimed that they had paid massive bribes to the king's inner circle, if not to the king himself, in exchange for securing the license. Aki later filed an affidavit declaring that he had given over $75,000 to Kalakawa's intermediaries, expecting exclusive rights to sell opium in the kingdom. When the license was awarded to another bidder, Aki cried foul, launching a scandal that would unravel at the speed of gossip and political convenience. While Kalakawa denied the accusations, and no definitive legal proof ever surfaced to confirm his direct involvement, the damage was done. The whispers were louder than the clarifications. To many Hawaiians, already uneasy with the increasing influence of foreign interests, the opium license scandal symbolized a deeper rot, a palace losing its moral footing, a monarchy too willing to auction its sovereignty in backroom deals. The image of a sacred kingship was eroding, replaced by something more cynical. Kalakawa, a ruler who once traveled the world as Hawaii's first global ambassador, began to be seen not as a unifier, but as a man surrounded by opportunists, flattered by dealers, and compromised by proximity. Within the royal court, the scandal took on a quiet toll. Ministers resigned. Political allies distanced themselves. Reformers, both native and foreign-born, used the scandal as leverage to push for constitutional changes. In 1887, just a year after the license controversy reached its boiling point, Kalakaua was forced to sign the Bayonet Constitution, a document that stripped the monarchy of most of its power, transferring authority to an oligarchic legislature dominated by American and European business elites. The monarchy, once an embodiment of indigenous dignity, had been functionally neutered, and opium, though not the sole cause, had played its part. Was there widespread use of the drug within the palace itself? Perhaps. While direct evidence of royal consumption remains elusive, the political culture around the court was certainly awash in it. High-ranking officials, Chinese merchants, and foreign entrepreneurs were all part of the same network, profit-driven, loosely policed, and eager to convert proximity to power into product. The palace became, in the eyes of many, not just a place of governance, but a gate through which the right favor could deliver lucrative rights to vice. King Kalakaua died in 1891, just 4 years after signing away much of his authority. His sister, Queen Liliuokalani, would take the throne, only to face an even more aggressive push toward annexation. The kingdom fell in 1893. A century-old monarchy dissolved not with an invasion, but with a signature. The opium scandal did not topple the Hawaiian throne, but it showed how thin the foundation had become, how a monarchy surrounded by global forces, domestic pressures, and seductive economies could be drawn into complicity by simply standing still. And yet, even this tale of political erosion and moral ambiguity had echoes elsewhere. Because across the ocean, back in the drawing rooms of Britain, another royal circle, elegant, educated, and equally entangled, was already steeped in a more private crisis. Not of corruption, but of consumption itself. 25. George IV's brothers and circle. In the drawing rooms of Regency-era Britain, surrounded by velvet wallpaper and candlelit mirrors, the House of Hanover played its own version of aristocratic roulette. Here, powdered wigs masked thinning hairlines, and ceremonial uniforms couldn't quite disguise the weight of indulgence. This was not an age of subtlety. This was an age of excess. Architectural, culinary, political, and in that constellation of extravagance, one bright flickering star was George IV. But orbiting him were other royals, his brothers and courtiers, who indulged just as deeply, and in some cases more quietly, in the narcotic comforts of the time. while George IV himself has already claimed his place on this list, famously reliant on laudanum, wine, and the exhausting machinery of his own ego. The circle that surrounded him was equally steeped in the medicinal and recreational narcotic culture of the 18th and 19th centuries. And at the heart of this circle sat laudanum, that elegant bottle of alcohol-laced opium dispensed by doctors as liberally as small talk. To understand how deeply entwined this royal milieu was with laudanum, one must begin with context. In late Georgian and early Victorian Britain, laudanum was everywhere. It was sold over the counter, recommended by physicians, and used to treat everything from gout to grief. It came in delicate bottles with florid labels and was mixed into tonics, elixirs, and fashionable cordials. Aristocrats took it for digestion, poets took it for inspiration, and royalty took it for everything in between. Among George IV's brothers, of whom there were plenty, 15 children in total had been born to George III and Queen Charlotte. Several were known for their extravagant habits, unstable temperaments, and a shared reliance on medical crutches that included laudanum. One prominent example was the Duke of Sussex, Prince Augustus Frederick. Known for his intellectual pursuits and progressive views, he also suffered from chronic respiratory problems and various ailments for which laudanum was likely prescribed. References in correspondence and court medical logs point to frequent treatments consistent with opiate-based medication, especially in his later years as his health declined and his ability to appear in public waned. Prince Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, later King of Hanover, another of George IV's brothers, had a more politically charged reputation, hardline, reactionary, deeply unpopular in certain liberal circles, but he too was part of a court environment where laudanum was as common as afternoon tea. In these circles, emotional regulation often took pharmaceutical form, whether for headaches, fatigue, or the more vague diagnosis of nervous upset. Opium tinctures were the silent ally of the elite. This was also the era of Lady Jersey and Lady Hertford, royal mistresses and courtiers, whose salons hummed with social intrigue and whispers of who was taking what. Physicians like Sir Henry Halford, personal doctor to both George III and George IV, openly prescribed laudanum to patients at court. His notes reflect a medical culture that saw little distinction between alleviating symptoms and suppressing them entirely. Pain, physical or psychological, was not to be understood, but managed. Within this royal circle, dependency became part of routine. There are accounts of ministers and private secretaries delaying meetings because one prince or another was resting, a euphemism often understood to mean recovering from the effects of a dose. Some took it before public appearances to steady nerves or mask chronic discomfort. Others, more quietly, took it to escape. Laudanum didn't raise eyebrows because it was not considered deviant. It was civilized. The very bottle that would today be locked in a pharmacy safe was once proudly displayed on a writing desk, nestled between snuff boxes and miniature portraits. Dependency, if acknowledged, was described in medical terms, never moral ones. Yet the consequences were real. The fog of opium dulled not only pain, but perception. Decision-making slowed, emotions frayed, communications grew erratic. And in moments when leadership was needed, the response from the royal household could be maddeningly delayed or confused. While not every royal brother fell victim to outright addiction, many lived in the grey area between therapeutic use and dependency, a quiet erosion of clarity in a court already known for its indecision. When George IV died in 1830, the throne passed to his brother William IV, another Hanoverian prince with a complicated relationship to excess. The age of Victoria would soon begin, bringing with it a new brand of moral strictness and imperial ambition. But beneath the starch and lace of that later era still lingered the habits of the Regency, habits born in candlelit rooms, passed through crystal decanters, and measured in teaspoons of something that promised to take the edge off a crown. And so ends this list of 25 royals, emperors, kings, princes, and courtiers who, in one way or another, ruled under the influence. Whether through pipes in palaces or tinctures in drawing rooms, they reached for the same quiet answer to the unrelenting noise of power. But perhaps the real mystery isn't why they turned to these substances. It's what they were trying to escape: the loneliness of leadership, the impossibility of expectation, the unbearable weight of ceremony, or maybe just themselves. Whatever it was, they reached for silence. And in the end, that silence reached back.